I'm Maxime Forrest. I'm a member of the team of one of the two supporting partners in Gender Smart, Yellow Window, which is a consultancy agency with a strong specialization on gendering research based in Antwerp, in Belgium. I'm myself a gender expert and scholar, specialized on gender equality policies and notably in research organizations. As for the project, I just presented it. It is bringing together 8 organizations, 6 of which are implementing ones. And there is a, as it is usually the case in this type of EU-funded initiative, there is a specialization, an area of specialization in this particular project that you know probably, which is about agriculture and agriculture for development, be it at regional or international level, but that does not encapsulate for sure the peculiarities of each organization, because we have also inside this consortium the French National Research Agency, which is the main research funding agency in France that funds research in many, many other areas. So what are the main objectives for us in this webinar? They are quite modest, provided the length and that the fact that it is an introductory one. It is first to introduce you basic concepts with definitions which are not too far-reaching or theoretical, but will provide us with a common ground to start from our discussion. Then it is evidencing the main challenges with regard to making organizational culture in research organization more gender and diversity sensitive. And we will do so through a brief historical glance and complemented by a few data and basic information. But it is also to take you through potential solution toward making your organization more gender sensitive, solutions that are meant to be practical, but also comprehensive and connected to each other. So let's start with a few basic definitions so we have a common understanding of what is at stake, and I apologize in advance if they are not complex enough. Let's start with two very basic definitions, which are nonetheless requested, but because the confusion between the two terms is quite frequent. Sex is different from gender, and sometimes this confusion is so obvious. When you take a plane to the United States, or when you took a plane, you used to take a plane prior to the COVID-19 crisis to the United States, for instance, the US Customs Services ask you to fill in a questionnaire where they ask about your gender. And most likely they were asking about your sex, actually, not your gender identity or your sexual orientation or whatever else, but about simply the fact whether you will qualify yourself as a male or female, as a man or as a woman. So sex refers to mostly biologically determined characteristics of human beings, of men and women, in terms of their reproductive organs and reproductive functions, based also on chromosomal complementarity and physiology. And therefore, sex is usually understood as the classification of living things, and not only human beings, as male or female. So it is rather, these are rather fixed categories, but nevertheless, we know that nature accommodates a lot more of complexity, and that sex cannot be fully encapsulated in this binarity. But nevertheless, the notion is that it is linked to biology and that it is rather fixed. Gender, by contrast, refer to the social construction of women and men, to femininity and masculinity as two categories that vary across time and places and between cultures. So it is a concept that is apparently much more fluid than sex, much less fixed, but again, that cannot be put in such bold terms, because actually the changes in the definition of gender roles, of the distribution of tasks and capabilities between men and women, as we know, usually take a lot of time. The gender changes that we observe in the respective positions of women and men in societies across the globe is patent, it's clear. So it makes clear that it is a more fluid and more mobile and labile category, but usually it is also clear that it takes a lot of time. I would like also to clarify what we are talking about when we are striving for gender sensitivity and gender equality. What we are not actually too much discussing, and what usually takes a lot of time to discuss, is difference. We are not typologizing differences between men and women. Actually, the problem is not difference. There might be differences that might come from biological, sex-related dimensions, or mostly from the socially constructed ones, that is gender. But differences are not so much at stake when we talk about equality. What is at stake is the fact and is how these differences are being valued in society and how they are likely to impact people's lives. So what we see that activities, attitudes, possibly skills as well, which are stereotypically associated with the category of masculinity, still tend to be valued more highly. You certainly can find a few exceptions to that rule, but that remains largely the rule, and that's actually the issue. The issue is hierarchy rather than difference, because this different value attributed to what is related stereotypically to masculinity or femininity results in more or less explicit hierarchies between both categories, which lead in return to inequality of opportunities, but also to these bolder terms, which are segregation and discrimination. So if what we are discussing is not so much difference, but the way those differences are being valued, for instance, in a research organization, then when we discuss gender equality, we are talking about a situation in which individuals of both sexes are free to develop their own personal abilities. They are free to make choices without being strictly limited by within the limits, the boundaries of strictly defined gender roles. It is a situation where the behaviors, the aspiration, the experiences, but also the needs of women and men are considered and valued equally in the issue that concerns us today, the context of a human organization. But gender equality, it's also a process. It's not only the point of arrival. Therefore, it is also a situation in which efforts are constantly devoted to removing gender bias and to combating stereotypes that fuel the reproduction of those inequalities. And when we are discussing organizational culture, what are we actually talking about? If I refer to the definition put by the European Institute of Gender Equality, which is an agency of the European Commission based in Vilnius, the organizational culture appears to be a key factor that can either contribute or, in many cases, rather hinder the creation of enabling environments where both women and men can have fulfilling careers, in particular in the research sector. And therefore, this area covers a variety of aspects that I will detail a bit more later on when we come to how to act towards a gender-sensitive organizational culture. All aspects that promote an enabling and working environment in which both men and women can thrive, feel good in their jobs, benefit from equal opportunities to develop their careers, and generally speaking, have fulfilling lives. So it is a vast body of issues that we will cover later on, but that's the basic definition. Prior to evidencing through a few data and information, the main issues at stake when we are discussing gendering research organization, we should wonder first why we should bother at all to make a research organization more gender sensitive. Well, we should bother at all first because science as, let's say, an area of human endeavor is gendered, and because the institutions devoted to that area, that particular area of human endeavor, are gendered as well. And that's an historical fact. That's not something that comes from yesterday, and that we should feel ashamed and individually fully accountable for. But still, we do share part of the accountability of this history and part of the solution as well. When I say that science is gendered, well, it looks a little bit like that. When you put as keyword famous scientists, and that's obviously especially the case in those languages as English, when you have not a grammatical distinction for immediately available, that's how it looks like. It returns you an infinite amount of pictures of overwhelmingly male figures. And that's how looks history of science in practically all domains. And that's not something that should surprise us, because it comes, as I said, from long ago. What is not gendered, certainly, is the quest for knowledge. It is the fact of formulating hypotheses, of building systematic or evidence-based reasoning, because those are equally available to men and women, to Ptolemy, the geographer, or to Hypatia of Alexandria that we see on the left of the picture, teaching in the representation of the 19th century. But as you maybe know, those early scientific minds from the antiquity did not benefit from the same recognition, nor did they share the same bright fates and the possibility to advise and educate princes, for instance, because gender stereotypes soon apply. And what has not been historically equally available to men and women is the access to research career and to research institutions themselves. On those pictures, you see above a series of portraits that you can see when you enter the rectorate building of the old University of Porto in Portugal. But this type of gallery of portraits you may find in most of the most established research organizations across the globe. That's a common feature. And the longer histories they do have, the most likely you will see this type of predominantly or exclusively male figures. Another aspect which is important is that while science is a very ancient area of human endeavor, research organizations are not that old. Universities were mostly established from the 12th or 13th century onwards, and many after the 15th or 16th century. Academies of sciences, well, they do exist, were usually established in the 19th century, as the one that you see on this picture in Hungary, Latvia, or Poland. And they have been established, both universities or academies of science, as institutions of power, as institutions with a strong hierarchy, with strongly determined processes of decision-making, which obviously have evolved over time, have changed as science as such has changed, but which still bear the historical marks of their passes of institutionalization throughout time, which is absolutely logical, and which is something that we notice for a number of institutions related to hierarchy and power. So we do inherit of that. Some may say, and some may ask through the chat box already, that, okay, but not every scientific field has the same history, and not every country has the same relation to a particular scientific field. That's all true. And definitely, if you look at computer sciences, for instance, they were born after World War II. Were they less gendered than more ancient, than older areas of research? Well, not so much, because they were born in the military during World War II in another very hierarchical and male-dominated field. So we all inherit from those situations, and that will be very, very surprising that this inheritance does not leave any print in the way an organization works, in the way it is structured, in the way it values the scientists that work for it and the staff in general, but also in the way it produces science, it produces knowledge and research. So if science is gendered historically, if scientific and research institutions have been gendered setting for since they were established, then the knowledge which has been produced through these institutions is also likely to be gendered. And there is a lot of evidence that failing to take into account the potential sex differences, but also the gendered roles and conducts of women and men in society that remain very different, also in those societies that have achieved a certain level of gender balance and equality, can ultimately lead to gender-biased research. And gender-biased research necessarily address very unevenly and very unequally the needs of both sexes. It can simply miss their very needs or their very physiological, psychological, or attitudinal differences. And here you just have a few of those typical examples that we put to support this claim. One being the fact that for very long, for epidemiological and gendered reasons, the signs of cardiovascular, the symptoms of cardiovascular diseases, and especially heart failures, were based on an androcentric model, a male-centered model. So they were basically the symptoms of men, because men were those overwhelmingly, predominantly suffering heart failures. But as women started to smoke, as they started to work in paid employment in similar proportion as men, as they started to have also an unhealthy habit and so on, and exposure to similar environmental factors, they also started to suffer cardiovascular diseases and heart failures, but with very different symptoms that it has taken long to science, to biomedical science, to recognize, acknowledge, and actually address. And that's still very much not the case, as the difference of figures shows that when women and men are suffering a heart attack, women are more at risk of dying from it because their symptoms are likely not to be recognized. And from the engineering side, you see also this dummy for crash test, which is in this case is a pregnant woman. But it was not prior to the mid-2000s that the first car manufacturers were actually discovering that, as it had been the case in the 1950s or even earlier, women were driving as well. And that women had different body mass, had different average sizes, and that therefore passive and active safety in the cars was not properly designed from them, to the point that in developed countries, the second cause for prenatal deaths was actually car crashes. So it was an epidemiological problem at the end. So we have gendered settings, we have gendered institution, we have a knowledge which is produced in such settings and is likely to be gender biased as well. But then we might wonder, how is it possible that through time we have not changed the picture? Well, if we have not been able to change the picture as the society was evolving, and so were gender roles, is also because of the role played by unconscious bias. There is a fuel, there is gasoline in this process that vehicles and power the reproduction of stereotypes and inequalities, notably in research organization settings. And this gasoline, this powering fuel are bias which are largely unconscious. So let's define what unconscious bias are about. Unconscious bias occurs when we make judgments or decisions mostly on the basis of our prior experience, or on the basis of our deep-seated thought patterns and assumptions. And basically, we are not aware that we are doing it. So that corresponds to, let's be honest, maybe 95 or over percent of the decision that we make on a daily basis. We do not make so much informed judgments. We do not mobilize so much reflection prior to making a decision. And that's fortunate, because that will take a hell of time, and we will not be so efficient as human beings. We categorize situations, we quickly put them in one box, and from that box we infer a decision that we make prior to an informed judgment. But making a decision prior to an informed judgment is the very definition of prejudice, prejudicare. It is what you do prior to making, to reflecting upon a situation. And the irony is that this is a byproduct of the efficiency of our human cognition. That is something that makes us as human, as living things, very efficient. That's part of our very intelligence, but that's also the fuel of prejudices and of gender bias in particular, because one of the main elements upon which that forges our experience of life is gender, because it is something that we see as an organization principle of human life from the very moment we come to this world. And that's what makes it especially powerful. I would like to share with you a very short video from the Royal Society in the UK, which is committed to enhancing research and scientific standards, and that deals actually with the notion of unconscious bias. So let's put it through. It's about 2 minutes and a half long, and I hope that the sound will be okay. If not, please tell me.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1 10p. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10p. The answer is actually 5p. Many of us choose 10p without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social, and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful. which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we...
Sorry, I see that there is a problem with video, that it stopped working. Is that correct? Sorry. Yes, okay. And okay, did you have the sound still or did it stop as well? No, just sound, but the video was fine. Okay, I will put it again, not from scratch, but I will share it again. So I apologize about that. And the sound is the most important thing anyway. So, I'm sorry, there was a problem in the middle.
How much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10 pence. The answer is actually 5 pence. Many of us choose 10 pence without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social, and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
Thank you for giving attention to this video. I will now get back to the presentation. If I can, yeah. And here we're back, I hope. So now we can get quickly through the issues at stake that are powered by this historical account I briefly went through, and by the efficiency of those unconscious bias. So the main issues at stake that define the picture of research organization are well known, well documented, and also at EU level, and they comprise of horizontal segregation, that is the fact that men and women are not distributed the same way across research areas, from natural sciences through engineering and technology to medical sciences or agricultural sciences or humanities, and that this distribution is very uneven as well from a country, that is from a particular research context to another, which tells that this is related very much to gender settings and to cultural settings, and not to predisposition, and especially to natural predisposition. Otherwise, this distribution would be quite even, on the contrary. But those issues also comprise of vertical segregation. That is a fact that when we look at a typical career path, as on this graph, which depict the typical career path across different research areas and European countries, we see that women and men are not present in similar proportion, and the proportion of women is decreasing all along the way, from the PhD level toward the upper position and ranks in a career, in a scientific career. So at the beginning of the career, in many EU countries and most of the fields now, women are overrepresented because they are overperforming also in secondary education, which make them more prone to engage in higher education and later in research activities. But when we look at the end of the career, and especially what happened in the mid or early stages of a research career, when people are taking their first permanent position, then the proportion of women start decreasing and decreasing sharply. And this situation is even worse when we look at the so-called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, where we do not have this size or shape, but we have actually a situation in which women are largely underrepresented at the very beginning of the career, accounting for, on average, 30% of the total number of graduate students, and even less represented at the end of the careers, with a proportion which is usually below 15% on average. This is usually depicted as a leaky pipeline of women of science. Women are leaking out of the pipeline all along the way, from the graduate stages in the middle, in the very beginning of their career, through the PhD level, and towards being awarded permanent position and getting access to decision-making and senior research position. And what is important here is that they are leaking out, which means that they are not simply underrepresented, but many of them simply disappear from the pipeline. And this pipeline is drying out as it comes toward the higher position, meaning that selection processes are based on a narrowing pool of potential candidates, talents, and basically brains. Because when women leak out, they usually leak with their brain, which is quite logical, yes. But this situation is covering other issues. Less documented, for instance, is the gender bias which exists in the access to research resources, that is, to research funding, which we know that it is a key driver for a research career nowadays. What we see where this has been documented, which is in a number of contexts and articles, but not in a systematic and comparative way, is that when things turn personal, which means when we are no longer at the stage of examining or scrutinizing a research proposal, but of interviewing people, that is men and women, then gender bias and unconscious bias in general are coming into play to a larger extent, partly explaining this broadening gap between the number of female and male applicants and the number of male and female awardees of those research funding. And we could go on with a number of examples. For instance, gender bias in access to international research mobility, which is also a key driver for research careers nowadays. There is a gap that amounts up to 10 or 11%, for instance, in Slovakia or Poland or Ireland, in terms of women and men researchers accessing research mobility opportunities, which also tells a lot about the relation to gender settings, to gender roles, and to cultural norms, but also to the market of research and to the opportunities both at home and abroad for researchers. So we see that we need to act. And we need to act because we are actually operating in very gendered settings, and that it is not fully fair because it apparently reproduces inequalities and hierarchies within our organizations. But how do we do actually to be gender sensitive? Well, first we should start from what we know. And we know already quite a lot because there has been plenty of initiatives, both at organizational, regional, national, or European, or even international level to gendering research organization. Among the things we know is what I just explained, that research institutions are deeply gendered settings where processes, but also scales of evaluation, of promotion, for instance, or even language, both visual and written, tend to be gender biased. Academic and professional merits of excellence, which are thought to be core to our research area, are not gender neutral concepts. Actually, they are not neutral concepts at all. In the sense that they convey also unconscious bias about a typical pattern of a research career. It's timing, when someone should apply for which type of position, in which order, for how long. And all of this is to some extent disconnected from the very notion an objective evaluation and assessment of personal merits. It is linked to a scale, to a pattern of career that has been defined often a long time ago, not very much discussed among people participating to research activities, and in many cases, not very much updated to changes in society and to the needs of people. And appraisal criteria which we are applying in our respective organization are not always defined and communicated as transparently as we think. And it takes usually not very long to assess that when we take the time of properly auditing those processes, because then we realize that we may have criteria, but those criteria are not consistently applied, and they are not understood the same way by all stakeholders involved in the process of assessment, nor by the candidates. But we know also that work-life balance is not a woman-only issue, and that it affects the overall functioning of an organization and the career opportunities of people who work in it. And it costs us usually quite some effort to understand that, because we tend to see research organization as isolated structures, isolated from life, from their environment, but they are not. People who come inside to work every morning, they have also a life, they belong to a community, they commute, they have other responsibilities and contributing to science and to knowledge production and dissemination. And that's quite a matter of fact. Therefore, they should be considered also in interrelation with their environment. We have also enough experience now accumulated about implementing positive action, positive measure, to document how they actually work. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is a number of preconceptions about positive action, often triggered by the notion of positive discrimination, a notion which is a bit devaluated because people tend to retain the second part of the exception, which is discrimination. They think that positive discrimination is discriminating. Well, actually, it is a status quo which is discriminatory, and positive actions is about controlling bias, which is quite a scientific behavior per se. But we know what it takes to implement those positive actions, and we know under which condition they deliver the promise of change. A big question we should ask ourselves about as well, it is the level where we should act upon first, or to which we should devote most of our efforts towards change. Is it the individual level, what is put here on this graph as the self, or is it the organizational level, the part below of this cycle, corresponding to culture and attitude, to talent management, to decision making, for instance, and to processes in general? Well, experience shows that both are relevant, but that it is sound to devote most of the effort to the organizational level, because it is not so much individuals who are in cause in this process of reproducing inequalities and imbalances. It is the structure. It is the way it has been built over time, as I said. It is the way it is functioning, in many cases with a lot of inertia, with just doing things as they used to be done, with a lot of changes as well, but not necessarily connected to improving the work environment and the organizational culture. Maybe to make it more economically efficient or environmentally efficient, but taking every single of those aspects in a silo without connecting them with each other and with the notion of diversity or gender equality. So if we do intend to act at the organizational level, what should be the main areas of actions to be considered in order to actually change the organizational culture? And that's obviously not a tick-the-box exercise. You are not bound to always act upon every single of those aspects together. You might consider some priority due to the specific circumstances and features of your own organization. But generally speaking, we are supposed to deal with recruitment, promotion, and career management as a whole, with access to decision-making positions, but also decision-making processes, the way decisions are actually taken within the formal norms, but also within informal norms of decision-making process. And also to resource distribution, how the resources in terms of technical and scientific facilities, grants and money and resources, financial resources and human resources are distributed across the organization. And usually this is very much revealing or hierarchies that might be hidden. It is also about, obviously, work-life balance and flexible working arrangements. We are living in a time where telework has suddenly becomes a norm and unexpectedly becomes a norm. And we see that telework is not exempt by far from gender bias, and that it might provide more flexibility and opportunities for reconciling work and private life, but it also entails a number of gender challenges. And women who are experiencing now telework in massive numbers, notably in research organizations, are reporting specific difficulties, which are reflecting in very important aspects such as their capacity to produce scientific work and papers. And there are evidences that the number of scientific articles submitted to scientific journals by female researchers is plummeting during this COVID crisis due to work-life balance issues. So promoting work-life balance as something which is good for both men and women is important, but we have to be careful not to fuel further discrimination or inequalities. It is also about childcare and parental leave provisions in relation to those childcare and parental leave provisions at a national level as well. It is about equal opportunities in accessing research mobility, but also in accessing visibility within the organization and how the contribution of both men and women is valued within the organization. It can be as well about rethinking facilities, buildings for greater inclusion and accessibility, because as I said, we are operating in organizations that were created often and built at a time when women were not very much admitted in higher education and research, and therefore they do not reflect a very inclusive notion, and this can be corrected as well without demolishing any historical building for sure. Preventing ordinary sexism, sexual harassment, and gender-based violence is also a part of this picture. how is it possible to steer toward a gender inclusive and sensitive organization if signs and expressions of ordinary sexism or sexual harassment are not properly addressed and efficiently tackled? And it is as well about gender and diversity sensitive communication, a communication that reflects this progressive change in values and organizational features, and that makes it visible also. So now what we know in terms of solutions about how to transform effectively organizational cultures, now that we have went through the different issues at stake, the areas of actions to be tackled, and the level to which they should be primarily addressed, which is the organizational one. Well, effort, as I said, should primarily tackle the organizational level rather than individuals, because individual there are plenty, and organization there is apparently only one. So better to devote your effort to a level that can change the life of individuals in general terms. Raising awareness is important, as we do through this webinar today, but it is definitely not sufficient. Institutional processes, institutional documents should also be reviewed and addressed so as to reflect this notion of gender sensitivity. There are tools which already exist and have been tested in a number of organizational settings to ensure diversity among candidates, among panel or selection panels or committee members, and at the end, among recruitees. These tools include a mentoring scheme, guidelines and checklists for recruitment panel or promotion panel members, so as to control, as we at the Science Society of UK suggests in this video, the unconscious bias that we are all tending to reproduce. Blind assessment as well has been largely implemented, as well as more specific techniques and more planning techniques, such as a cascade model, which is a model of for recruitment planning, so as to bring more diversity and gender balance, which is considering the proportion of women, for instance, within at a certain level in the pool of a potential candidate at a certain level, to plan the proportion that should be reached for the upper level. And this is what it is called a cascade one. So it is not positive discrimination, but it is some sort of a positive measure because there is planning, and it is based on reality, on the available pool of talents, but making sure that the organization is not increasing the gap, but helping to bridge it. And when other things do not work, or when the changes are not delivered, then we can consider positive action in order to bridge the gap faster, or when, for instance, the legislative and policy environment is prone to supporting this positive action. What we know as well is that gender-sensitive communication helps challenging gendered pattern and help to make changes more visible. So I will just go through a few examples and refer you to a database of good practices that you can after investigate more in detail in relation to the different issues that have been I have been covering until now. Many of those recommendations, guidelines, and toolkits are emerging from new funded initiative as Gender Smart, and Gender Smart will certainly make a crucial contribution to that body of practices and knowledge. Here I take the example of the FESTA recommendation coming from the FESTA project, of which you get the web address to the bottom. It addresses institutional processes, procedures, and culture, but also a recommendation to empower women. And as you can see, it brings together a number of potential levers from making this gender situation visible through participatory audits as the ones that have been carried out in your respective institution as part of this Gender Smart project, through training decision makers and raising awareness about gender, but also ensuring gender balance in all key committees, or implementing systems of regular gender auditing of the organization. So measures which are aimed at documenting the situation, the baseline situation, improving transparency and accountability, and ensuring that the processes and procedure and the culture of the organization as a whole are made more gender sensitive and are not contributing to reproducing bias and inequalities. If I turn to the question of gender sensitive communication as a first example, I will now turn to another youth-funded initiative, which is still going on, a so-called sister project of Gender Smart, which is the Super App project, which has been developing guidelines on gender sensitive communication that will be soon made available online. And these guidelines, which are not the first to be produced on this particular issue, are addressing communication as a core and multi-layered activity of research organization that convey a number of messages through a plurality of channels, visual and graphics, websites, digital communication, also on social media, relations to the medias, the organization of event, and the use of gender-sensitive language in internal and external communication support. And gender bias have been and can be in your own organization very much certainly identified and challenged in every single aspect of this institutional communication, which can in turn help redefining the organizational culture, because actually visual and linguistic element play a great role in conveying the idea of what this organization is about, what is its pledge towards society, what it intends to deliver to people, to the nation, or to humanity as a whole, or to through international cooperation project. And all of that is made clear and disseminated through communication devices. And if those are gender biased, then the message is as well. So in these super guidelines, you will find soon a number of operational definitions and of practical hints to make communication of your organization actually a part of the change process, from how the pictures and organization of your website communication to the organization of event. I assure you that not everything is put in graph or pictograms. It is also about contents and definition and processes. But it takes you through the whole process of making your communication gender sensitive. And actually it works in the sense that it is one of the most visible change that a research organization can experience. And it usually triggers discussion about further steps to be taken. Because then people realize, okay, so now we are gender sensitive in organizing events or communicating about ourselves, but what about our recruitment process? What about childcare facilities and so on? So that's also a driver for further change. And you will find a lot of those practices with guidance on how to implement them or transfer them or adapt them efficiently in your own organization in the gender equality in research action tool that has been put together by the European Institute of Gender Equality, and which is available now online. I would like now to conclude my presentation and to open the discussion by very briefly discussing the notion of meritocracy and fairness, because we realize that one of the main, I would say, objection, which is formulated in research and scientific organization across the world when it comes to making them more gender sensitive is precisely about meritocracy. We are bound to meritocracy because we think, as members of a research organization or researchers ourselves, that meritocracy is key to select the best talents and ideas, the best protocols, and to make our internal processes as evidence-based and objective as possible. And that's true. The question is that which meritocracy do we have? Which type of merits do we assess, and on which basis? And are those bound to the notion of fairness? Because meritocracy can be this as well. It can be a situation in which you are definitely on the same line of departure, but you are not facing, you are not actually doing the same sport, practicing the same sport. You are in front of a number of hindrances and impediments which are not considered by the process of selection or merit assessment. And therefore, if a different situation, an objectively evidence different situation is not addressed by a process which is meant to be the same for everyone, then the process is by definition discriminatory, because it is treating the same a situation which is different. And that's important to remind ourselves that treating employees the same is not equivalent to treating them equally. And in most cases, same treatment revealed to be quite unfair, as on this cartoon. And it is also important to underline that treating employees differently is not equivalent to treating them discriminatorily. Treating employees the same is often known in management as a strategy of assimilation. So it entails that everyone conform to the dominant organizational culture. Alternatively, an organization can use a process of integration which respect and encourage the expression of individual differences, but will treat everyone equally so as to allow changes in the organizational culture, which is the very purpose that we have been dealing with today. So we should be able to recast our notion of merit. Is merit fitting a standard that has been designed a long time ago, in many cases, mostly based on an androcentric or male-centered model, and without considering the occupations and duties that human beings, both men and women, do have outside from their job? Or are we able to actually assess merit in a way that do not contribute to reproducing inequalities? And that's all what this structural change process that we are driving in Gender Smart is meant to be about. And now I will be pleased to take your question and remark and to discuss them.